I, 50F, never thought I would be writing a post like this about my own son Oliver, 25M. I guess I should start from the beginning. I met my ex-husband Mark when I was 20, and we got married a year later. We were happy, or at least I thought we were, until he met Linda, 60F, at his workplace when Oliver was 10. Within 6 months, my marriage fell apart and Mark left us for Linda, who was already well established in her career and came from a wealthy family. The divorce was brutal. Mark promised he would always be there for Oliver, but his visits became less frequent as he built his new life with Linda. He would miss Oliver's school events, claiming he was too busy with work. The truth was he was taking luxury vacations with Linda. We would find out through social media posts. The child support checks were always late, and when Oliver turned 18, they stopped completely. I worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night. We moved from our nice house to a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a not-so-great area. Oliver had to change schools, leave his friends behind, and learn to live with less. But we made it work. I made sure he never went hungry, always had clean clothes, and got the education he needed. I skipped meals sometimes, wore the same clothes for years, but made sure Oliver had everything he needed for school. Linda tried to play stepmom in the beginning. She would buy Oliver expensive gifts that we couldn't afford, take him shopping when he visited their house, and try to bond with him. But Oliver saw through it. He told me once that every time he went to their house, Linda would make subtle comments about how much better his life could be if he lived with them. Oliver always chose to stay with me, which made Mark angry. When Oliver turned 18, Mark gave him an ultimatum: either accept Linda as his stepmom and be part of their family, or be cut off completely. Oliver chose to distance himself from both of them. Mark followed through with his threat and removed Oliver from his will. At the time, Oliver said he didn't care about the money, he just couldn't forgive them for what they did to me. Last year, Mark died suddenly from a heart attack. Oliver didn't even attend the funeral. Linda inherited everything: their mansion, Mark's successful construction business, all their properties and savings. She tried reaching out to Oliver after Mark's death, but he ignored her calls. I was proud of him for standing his ground. Life was going okay until 3 months ago when I needed knee surgery. The doctor said it was years of working on my feet that caused the damage. Oliver was amazing during this time. He took time off work to help me after the surgery, did all the household chores, and even learned to cook some basic meals. We were closer than ever, or so I thought. Then last month, everything changed. I was still recovering, barely able to walk without help, when Oliver dropped the bomb during dinner. He casually mentioned that he was moving in with Linda because she needed someone to take care of her. She has stage 4 pancreatic cancer and, according to him, only has 6 to 8 months to live. I was shocked. This was the same woman he had refused to acknowledge for years, the woman he blamed for breaking up our family. When I asked him about this sudden change of heart, he got defensive. He said Linda was all alone since Mark died and needed help. I reminded him that Linda has a sister, Jane, who lives just an hour away and has always been close to her. Oliver dismissed this, saying Jane was too busy with her own family to care for Linda. What hurt me most was his timing. He knew I was still struggling with basic tasks after my surgery. I couldn't even get to the bathroom without help some days. When I pointed this out, he said I could hire a caregiver with my insurance, but Linda needed family. Family? The woman who helped break up his parents' marriage was suddenly family? I tried to understand, really tried. But things weren't adding up. Oliver had never shown any interest in having a relationship with Linda before. In fact, just 2 months ago, he had refused to take her call when she tried to reach out on his birthday. The only thing that had changed was that Linda now had all of Mark's money and no children of her own. When I suggested that he might be doing this for the inheritance, Oliver exploded. He called me selfish, bitter, and jealous of Linda's lifestyle. He said I was trying to manipulate him into staying with me because I was lonely. His words cut deep because he knew how much I had sacrificed for him. While Mark and Linda lived in their mansion and took exotic vacations, I was working double shifts to put food on our table. Over the next few weeks, Oliver completely moved out. He took all his things and even the TV we had bought together for the living room. He said since he paid more towards it, it was his. Never mind that I had been paying for everything else in his life for the past 25 years. He stopped answering my calls regularly. When I managed to reach him, he was always too busy with Linda. Last week, I had severe pain in my knee and called him for help. He said he couldn't leave Linda alone because she was having a bad day. I ended up calling my elderly neighbor, who had to leave her grandchildren's birthday party to take me to the emergency room. Yesterday, I got a call from Sarah, who works at the law firm handling Linda's estate. She's an old friend from my waitressing days. She told me that Oliver had been bringing Linda to the office frequently, pressuring her to revise her will. Apparently, he had been suggesting that since he was giving up his life to care for her, he deserved to be compensated in her will. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't the son I raised. My Oliver would never take advantage of a dying woman. But the evidence was right there. He had abandoned me when I needed him most to cozy up to his wealthy, dying stepmom. The same woman he had refused to acknowledge for years was suddenly worth his time now that she had millions in inheritance to give. I debated for days about what to do. Finally, I decided to reach out to Linda. I wasn't sure if she would even agree to see me. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. But I had to try. I couldn't let my son turn into someone who would manipulate a dying woman for money. To my surprise, she agreed to meet me. Update 1: These past 2 weeks have been the hardest of my life. After Linda kicked Oliver out that night, he didn't leave quietly. He stood outside the house for hours, alternating between screaming threats and begging for another chance. Linda's neighbors called the police, and watching my son being escorted away by officers broke something inside me. The next morning, Oliver started his harassment campaign. He called me 47 times in one day. When I blocked his number, he used his girlfriend Amy's phone. When I blocked that, he started calling from random numbers. The messages he left were terrible, calling me a bitter old hag, saying I was jealous because Linda had lived the life I couldn't have, accusing me of ruining his chance at a better life. I had to change my number eventually. But then he started showing up at my apartment. The first time, I was alone and terrified. He banged on the door for an hour, screaming that I owed him for all the times he helped me after my surgery. My neighbors called the building security, but by the time they came up, he had left. Amy showed up a few days later. She tried to convince me that I was being unfair to Oliver. She said he was sleeping in his car, hadn't showered in days, and was at risk of losing his job because he kept missing work. She painted him as this tragic figure who just wanted to help his stepmom and was being punished for it. I almost wavered until she mentioned that Linda's mansion would have made a perfect home for her and Oliver after they got married. That's when I realized Amy was just as bad as Oliver. They had planned this together, getting close to Linda, securing the inheritance, and living off her money. I told Amy to leave and never come back. She called me heartless and said Oliver was right about me being jealous of anyone who had a better life. I later learned from my old neighbors that Oliver had indeed been sleeping in his car, but only for 3 days. He parked outside our old apartment building, probably trying to gain sympathy from people who knew us. When that didn't work, he moved in with Amy. So much for being homeless and desperate. Yesterday brought another twist to this nightmare. Linda's sister Jane came to see me. I was surprised because I had only met her once or twice during my marriage to Mark. She arrived with a thick folder of documents and a troubled look on her face. Jane revealed that Oliver's manipulation went deeper than any of us had imagined. He had been sending emails to their extended family, claiming that Linda's cancer medications were affecting her mental state. He suggested that I was taking advantage of her vulnerable condition to turn her against him. Some relatives actually believed him and had been pressuring Jane to intervene. But what really devastated me was what Jane showed me next. She had found emails between Oliver and Mark from last year, just months before Mark died. Apparently, Mark had been trying to reconcile with Oliver. He had reached out multiple times, admitting his mistakes and asking for a chance to make things right. Oliver's responses were cold and calculating. He told Mark that if he wanted a relationship, he needed to sign over part of his business to Oliver first. The emails were heartbreaking to read. Mark had actually offered to pay for Oliver's master's degree, to help him start his own business, anything to rebuild their relationship. But Oliver only wanted guaranteed assets. He told Mark that since he had chosen Linda over him as a child, he now had to pay the price for a second chance. I spent hours reading through those emails, watching my image of my son crumble. All these years, I had defended Oliver when people said he was wrong to cut contact with his father. I had believed he was standing up for me, choosing loyalty to his mother over Mark's money. But the truth was, he had been calculating his move even then. Jane also revealed something that made me physically sick. Oliver had been spreading lies about my condition after the surgery. He had created this whole story about me living with a fictional sister in another state, telling people he had begged me to let him help but I had refused. He used this lie to explain why he could devote all his time to Linda, because his selfish mother had rejected his help. The reality check was brutal. While I was struggling to get to the bathroom on my own, my son was telling people I had refused his help out of spite. He used my vulnerability to paint himself as the victim, the loving son whose mother pushed him away. The same people who had praised me for raising such a caring son had been fed lies about me being bitter and ungrateful. Linda's health has gotten much worse over the past week. Jane mentioned that the doctors have revised their timeline. They now think she has less than 3 months. Despite everything that's happened, Linda called me yesterday. She asked if I would consider moving in with her. She said we're both victims of Oliver's manipulation, both women who loved him and got betrayed. At first, I hesitated. It felt strange to even consider living with a woman my ex-husband left me for. But then I thought about my tiny apartment, where every corner reminds me of Oliver. Where I still sometimes call out for help before remembering he's not there anymore. Maybe Linda and I can help each other heal from the wounds Oliver left us with. Maybe we both need someone who truly understands how it feels to be betrayed by someone you gave everything to. I haven't given Linda an answer yet, but I'm seriously considering it. Life has a strange way of bringing unlikely people together, and right now, my ex-husband's widow might be the only person who really understands my pain. Update 2: Linda passed away last week, much sooner than anyone expected. The last month of her life was nothing like I imagined it would be. After I moved in, we developed an unexpected bond. We spent hours talking about everything: our childhoods, our marriages, our regrets. She told me that her relationship with Mark hadn't been the fairy tale everyone thought it was. He had been controlling with money despite their wealth, always reminding her that it was his business that made them rich. The night before she died, Linda made a full confession. She told me that she had actually tried to end things with Mark when she found out he was married, but he had pursued her relentlessly. He told her I was a cold, uncaring wife who had trapped him with pregnancy. I was angry at first, but then realized Mark had manipulated both of us. Linda cried as she told me how guilty she felt watching me struggle as a single mother while she lived in luxury. Linda's last day was peaceful. We had watched movies together, and she had even managed to eat a little soup. She went to sleep that night asking me to stay in her room. She said she was feeling unusually tired. I sat in the armchair next to her bed, and somewhere during the night, she quietly slipped away. The hospice nurse said it was a blessing that she went so peacefully. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The very afternoon after Linda died, while Jane and I were still making funeral arrangements, Oliver showed up with a lawyer. He hadn't even waited 24 hours before trying to stake his claim. The lawyer, a sleazy-looking man in an expensive suit, demanded immediate access to Linda's will and all her financial documents. He claimed they needed to ensure everything was in order before the funeral. Jane, thankfully, was prepared. Over the past month, she had documented everything. She had video recordings of Linda clearly stating why she was removing Oliver from her will. There were screenshots of all the manipulative texts Oliver had sent, emails where he pressured Linda about the inheritance, and even security camera footage from the days when he had shown up unannounced, demanding to speak to Linda's lawyer. But the most damning evidence came from Linda's old phone. Jane had found text messages that went back to even before Mark's death. Oliver and Amy had been planning this for over a year. They had actually celebrated when they found out about Linda's cancer diagnosis. There were messages where Oliver calculated how much money he could get, discussing with Amy how they would spend it. They had even planned which rooms in Linda's house they would renovate after she died. The messages revealed something even more disturbing. Oliver had known about Linda's cancer even before Mark's death. He had gotten the information from someone at the hospital where Linda was diagnosed. That's why he hadn't attended Mark's funeral. He was waiting to approach Linda when she was at her most vulnerable, after losing her husband. When Oliver's lawyer saw all the evidence, he actually excused himself and left. That's when Oliver showed his true colors. He started screaming about how we had turned a dying woman against him. He accused me of manipulating Linda just like he had manipulated her. According to him, I had moved in with Linda to secure my own inheritance. He said I was a gold digger who had probably celebrated when Mark died because it gave me a chance to get his money through Linda. The irony of his accusations wasn't lost on me. Everything he accused me of was exactly what he had done. He had celebrated Mark's death, manipulated Linda, and tried to secure an inheritance he didn't deserve. When security finally escorted him out, he was still screaming that I would regret this. Jane told me later that Oliver had already contacted several lawyers before this, but none would take his case after seeing the evidence. He had even tried to claim that Linda's cancer medications had made her mentally unstable when she changed her will, but her doctors had already certified that she was completely lucid until the end. Looking through those old messages was like reading a horror story where my son was the villain. There were texts where he joked about Linda's declining health, messages planning how to isolate her from her family, and detailed discussions about selling her house and artwork after her death. The son I raised, who once cried when we had to sell his old bicycle, had turned into someone who could gleefully plan to profit from a dying woman's death. Update 3: Life has taken such an unexpected turn in these past 3 months. Linda's final gift to me was her beach house, a small but beautiful property right on the coast. She added this to her will just 3 days before she died, saying she wanted to thank me for showing her kindness when everyone else was focused on her money. Jane told me that Linda had spent her last weekend alive making sure all the paperwork was properly done so Oliver couldn't contest it. Of course, Oliver still tried. He hired yet another lawyer, claiming that I had coerced a dying woman into giving me property. The case didn't even make it to court. Linda had recorded a video explaining her decision, and her doctor had signed off on her mental competency. Oliver's lawyer dropped the case after reviewing the evidence, making this his third failed attempt at contesting the will. I've moved into the beach house now. It's smaller than Linda's mansion but perfect for me. I turned the sunroom into a crafting space and started selling handmade jewelry online. It started as a way to keep my hands busy during lonely evenings, but it's actually turning into a decent business. Last month, I made enough to cover all my utilities and groceries. Oliver hasn't given up trying to contact me, though. He keeps creating new email accounts to send me messages. Last week, he even sent a handwritten letter, claiming he's changed and understood his mistakes. But in the same letter, he asked if I would consider sharing the beach house with him since it was too big for one person anyway. Some things never change. Amy's mother came to see me last month. She was horrified when she found out the truth. Apparently, Oliver and Amy had told her family an entirely different story. They claimed that Linda had promised to leave them her house, and I had manipulated her into changing her will because I was jealous of their relationship. Amy's mother apologized for believing them. She also told me that Amy and Oliver broke up after she found him planning to sell her grandmother's antique ring, a family heirloom he had promised to use for their engagement. The hardest part has been dealing with my memories. Every morning, I walk on the beach and think about the little boy who used to make sandcastles and chase seagulls. I look at old photos sometimes, trying to pinpoint when my sweet child turned into someone capable of such calculated cruelty. Was it when Mark left? When we had to move to the smaller apartment? Or was this darkness always there, and I was too blind to see it? Last week, Oliver's high school teacher ran into me at the grocery store. She asked about him, and for the first time, I didn't make excuses. I simply said we were no longer in contact. She seemed shocked and told me that Oliver had always been different, too focused on what others had, never satisfied with his own life. I hadn't seen it then, but maybe the signs were always there. I'm learning to live with my new reality. My knee has finally healed completely, and I can walk on the beach every morning. I've made friends with some local artists who sell their work online, and we meet weekly for coffee. Jane visits sometimes, bringing her grandchildren who fill the house with laughter. Sometimes at night, when I hear the waves crashing, I still cry for the son I lost. Not the man Oliver became, but the boy he used to be. I've finally accepted that while I'll always love that little boy, he doesn't exist anymore. The man who replaced him is a stranger, and maybe that's how it needs to stay. Would you like me to modify anything in this update or revise any part of the previous updates?